Okay, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to talk about the ValedForms Foundation classes. Now, the foundation classes were developed really as the foundation for the rest of the development in order to encapsulate the presentation layer, the Twitter Bootstrap, HTML, class libraries, JavaScript, in order to encapsulate it in such a way that you can focus on coding your application and not worrying about whether your div tags are mismatched or you're missing a quote. This just really makes it easier to focus on SQL, database programming, worrying about your business application than worrying about a mismatched tag. So if you're not familiar with Twitter Bootstrap, it's a very powerful framework that comes with a lot of built-in features like these drop-down menus, buttons that are very nice. It creates forms, it creates tables. It just has everything that you would possibly want, and it is very easy to extend using custom style sheets to create some really good looking and really powerful looking applications. I'm going to bring up one of my favorite templates. This is a template I found online that's built entirely using Twitter Bootstrap. You notice it's got things like these accordions that open up. It's got graphics. It's got these very nice pull down menus. You've even got a menu sidebar. And then you can even, if you want to, you can actually change the color of the application. So Bootstrap's really got a lot going for it. But then with that, because it's really a web development programming language and not a database application development language, when you start to look at the source, if I do a view page source, you're going to see, there's just a lot of nested div tags here. And if you look at things here like this table, you would have to be animated if this was a database driven application and these rows that were in here were coming from a database. You've got a lot of coding of begin and end tags that if you don't encapsulate this in some sort of a hierarchical object-oriented library, you're going to just get in trouble. And even when we were doing some prototypes of some of the early versions of ValedForms, we realized that this was necessary in order to do the complicated parts of the forms. So let me go back and I'm going to look at a very basic screen. Now this screen creates a very, very basic hello world template. And so what I've got here is I set some PHP variables so that I display my errors because I always have errors when I code. But all I really need to do to use the Valed Foundation classes is I just include class.valed.php. And then to get started, all I do is I create a new Valed page object. And then that will create the document. And then all I really need to do from this point is actually then write it to the screen. But what I'm going to do here in the middle is I'm creating a container. Now containers are very important in ValedForms. They're also very important in Bootstrap. But the reason they're so important is that's where your data is actually going to fall into. If you create a header detail block relationship between two tables, you're going to do that using two different containers. When you AJAX lists into your page, you're going to do that inside of a container. So a container can be different sizes, they can be different locations on the screen, but what you're doing here in this case is I'm creating a new variable called container as a valid container, and I'm giving it the ID of my container. And then that way when I use this container to hold different HTML or different form elements, I can then refresh it by referring to it as my container. So in this case, again, what I did is I created a new page as a valid page. Then I created a new container. I'm just going to use the add HTML function to add just hello world into the middle of it. Then I'm going to add the container to the body and I'm going to write the page. So if I go back here and I go to localhost and base.php, when that comes up, you see that I've got my hello world. So it looks like I wrote a lot of code to get hello world, but I really didn't, because what I did is I brought in all of the Bootstrap elements by doing it. So here I have my body, but I have my div with my container, and I have my hello world in it. So that seems like a very, very simple application, because it is. And as we go further and further into developing applications using the Valed framework, you're going to really start to take this kind of stuff for granted. Because as you're starting to query the databases, create block detail relationships, put tabs on your page, do commit processing, write triggers to validate data against the database, you really do not want to have to worry about the fact that you have a missing div tag. Or one of the things that kills me the most is if I get rid of one of these quotes, usually in a class, the whole rest of the page will just disappear. And you can spend hours looking for mismatched tags, especially with Bootstrap, because when you're looking at these applications, you're seeing exactly how complicated they can be. So from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at this theme. And I'm going to look at a piece of code using the Valed core framework to create this page looking exactly the way it looks, but instead of doing with HTML, I'm going to do it using the Valed framework. So let me start by, I'm going to do a view page source, and I'm looking at the page. So now when I look at this page, I've got the head, and then I've got the body. So inside of here, I've created a nav bar. I've got an icon bar. There's a pull down menu here. Now this looks, it's hierarchical only because you've got some nice indenting. But the reality is, if you mess up and you remove this line tag or you don't close the unordered list, okay, things start to go sideways really fast. So in this case, I've created a nav bar. I've got a theme. And then I'm creating, in this case, I'm showing what the different buttons look like. You know, we've got our large, our medium, and our small buttons, and then our extra small buttons. And then we've got some different types of tables. Now again, this is all done in HTML. And as you can see, if you were going to put a query in the middle of here, and you were going to populate each of these rows with the results of a query, you would be using a lot of print statements, you'd be using echo statements, you'd be, embedding PHP into HTML. Without using an MVC framework, which we're definitely not doing here, you could get yourself into a lot of coding nightmare if you're going to code it as straight HTML. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to bring up my example. So as you can see in my example, I've kind of got it indented the same way, but what I do here is, again, I've got making sure I'm displaying my errors, and then all I'm doing is I'm including the Valed core class library. I'm creating a page, and then in this case, the container is the entire page. Okay, and so I'm not giving it an ID, but there are some default classes that are tied to the container object. So you want to create a container because that's going to create a lot of the styling for the rest of the page. Now the next thing I'm going to do here is that nav bar that we talked about, where we had a begin nav and an end nav. That's all being done by first creating the nav, then putting a container inside the nav, then creating the div, then creating the button class. Now, navigation bars are actually created using buttons. It seems confusing, but once you get used to it with Bootstrap, you'll see that it's actually not that confusing. You're really just inheriting the classes from the attributes from the button class. So what I'm just doing here is I'm adding, it's all done doing the same process. You've got your outer element as a page, then you've got your container, and in this case we're starting and ending a navigation bar. And then we're adding all of these list items by, in this case over here, I'm creating a new list item. I'm creating an A tag, an anchor tag. I'm creating the href statement and then the label. And so as you see, this code it's just as much code. Don't fool yourself in thinking that converting the HTML to an object library means you're doing any less typing or you're coding less. It just means that it's so much easier to maintain, because you know that when I created this list item, when I created this li2, I created the li tag, but I also created the ending tag, the /li tag. So as I go through this, you can see that it looks a lot more like PHP. Now the output is still going to be HTML, and it's going to be extremely flexible. Now there's nothing you can't do with this, because each of these objects has different methods that allow you to do things. So in this case, I have got a div tag, and I want to I'm adding a class of Jumbotron to it. and then I'm creating an H1 called theme example. Now, if I wanted to here, let's say things just don't look right. And this is where Valed is really, really powerful, is my ability to, if I just want to add a style. So I could go in here and I could say add style, and I could say background color. I'm going to make the background in this case black. And I want to make maybe I'll make the color white. And then the things that I find myself using all the time is maybe things just didn't look right. So I want to do a margin left of 20 pixels. So what I can do here though is if I was editing this directly in the HTML, what you'll see is my lines will get really long because I've got an opening div tag, I've got a class of Jumbotron, now I'm adding a style with these background colors. It's really easy for me to get lost. Okay, so now if I'm using some jQuery, I can also add controls. So maybe I want to add a div, add to the div, I want to add controls, and in this case I'm going to add role equal data target. Okay, in this case I want to make sure I use my single ticks. And keep in mind, you can still screw this up by getting your single ticks and your double ticks mixed up, but it's just harder to do this way. So like in this case, so now what I would have done, that when this thing gets painted, it's going to paint as a div tag, an opening div tag with a class of Jumbotron, these styles, then it's going to have a role of data target. And then at some point here, I'm actually going to be adding using the add HTML function. In this case, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the H1 tag to it. Then I'm going to create a paragraph tag, and then I'm going to add the paragraph tag to it. And I'm just going through the whole, basically I'm creating the document object model by using this class library. And the class library is extremely simple. It's extremely easy to use. It's one of those things that as you start using it, you start to take it for granted. Because when you start using the other parts of ValedForms, you're going to find out that they're just so much more complicated, and you're doing so much more business logic work in the other using the other components as Valed, that these are just the things that you just start to forget about. You just know that you've got them, and if you find yourself hand coding HTML or hand coding JavaScript, you need to kind of take a step back and think about whether or not this would have been something that you would have been better off doing using the Valed Core class libraries.